Well, good afternoon, friends. We are now in our sixth week of this series. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention for those of you who are Redeemer folks, um, church services are going to be resuming, things of that nature. But to my knowledge, we are not resuming School of Discipleship. And so, that being the case, I'm going to continue doing this series. I'm going to finish it out. And so I believe that means there are 6 or 7 sessions left. And I may even do something into the summer, depending on what's going on or how things go or what kind of interest there is, stuff like that. So just be aware of that. The time will probably remain the same. Afternoon seems to work okay. So, having said that, let's proceed. So I want to just circle back to a few things that I mentioned in connection with that whole conversation surrounding Jesus, John the Baptist, and all of that stuff. And so back in, let me actually pull that up here. Back in Luke 7, we had this episode where John the Baptist, presumably now in prison, sends some of his disciples to go and ask Jesus whether or not he truly is the Christ. Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? So right here, beginning in chapter 7, verse 18, Jesus answers them by doing works of healing and sends them back to John. And then there's this whole conversation surrounding John, who he was, his role as the forerunner of the Messiah. Jesus declares him a prophet and more than a prophet. He sort of names him as the greatest man who's ever lived, almost. I tell you, among those born of women, none is greater than John. And we get this interesting statement where the people hear this, the tax collectors, they acknowledge the justice of God. They are in line with John's message, in line with Jesus's explanation of what he is there to do. But the Pharisees and the lawyers, were told here in verse 30, the people of this generation. It's fairly clear in the context of what he's saying here that he's referring to people who think like the Pharisees and the religious authorities. That is, those who reject the purpose of God. And he goes into this analogy, children sitting in the marketplace, basically saying, regardless of whether God sends you a prophet out in the desert like John, or someone like me who is healing people and eating with sinners, neither of these two extremes make you happy. You are not willing to accept what God is doing. And so this really is a change in tone for Jesus. Previously, when he has interacted with the scribes and the Pharisees, or criticized or responded to them in some way, he's always reacting to some sort of criticism that they have leveled against him. And yet here, without the authorities actually saying anything to him or about him, he sort of goes on the attack a little bit and directly criticizes them as being the men of this generation, the generation that is passing away, kind of the old generation that will be replaced by the dawning of the salvation of God. And so, as we have seen Jesus use Son of Man language to describe himself, the first 2 times we saw that, those episodes really developed this conflict with the authorities. The third time we saw it in the Sermon on the Plain, back in chapter 6, Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man, saying, blessed are you when they persecute you on account of the Son of Man, bringing the disciples into this conflict between him and those who oppose his mission. But this fourth instance of Son of Man language in Luke really says him, but he is actively criticizing them as people who are not in line with God's mission. And then, just kind of reviewing here, then we saw Jesus perform a series of miracles. We saw him calming the sea, saving his disciples from a storm. We saw him casting out Legion, this group of demons who had taken control of a man's life, excluding him from normal Israelite society. We also saw him both healing a woman who had a 12-year-long hemorrhaging and also raising the daughter of Jairus from the dead. And all of these scenes are one after the other. So we have this entire block of the text that's taken up by this sequence of miraculous deeds on the part of Jesus. And so really we get the sense that Jesus, in his mission, the one that he outlined back in Luke 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, bring sight to the blind, freedom to captives, etc. We get the sense that this mission is surging forward. All of these things are indicative of the coming justice of God. And throughout these scenes, nothing can stop Jesus. Nature cannot stop Jesus. The storm, he has control over that. This army of demons, Legion, cannot stop him. Uncleanness cannot stop him. The woman touching the hem of his garment to heal her hemorrhaging. There's issues of cleanness and uncleanness there in that story. That cannot stop him. And neither can death prevent Jesus from bringing about this restoration that is such a core part of his mission. And so his mission is going forward. And at least for the moment, this idea that Jesus is in conflict with the religious authorities, that there is that subplot, that kind of fades into the background. And so really we see the success, the actual manifestation of God's justice, that restoration, that is being put kind of on center stage. And so we don't really see the conflict being a key part of the story here. So for the moment, that tension has kind of dissipated. And so, right now we're moving into chapter 9. And this is, I think, a really fascinating part of Luke's story, because all of these things that have been building up so far are kind of coalescing in some of the things that Jesus is going to do and say here. And what I want you to keep track of as I begin going through this stuff is the cognitive dissonance between the positive progress of Jesus' mission that we've seen so far, but also the predicted outcome of Jesus' conflict with the authorities. Those two things are going to be in tension. There is a distinct difference between... Keep that in mind. But first, we have something interesting. We've already had Jesus call the 12 disciples, and interestingly, Luke, way back in, I believe it was chapter 4, already refers to them as apostles. And this is in some way kind of foreshadowing, perhaps, the sending out of the disciples, the apostles in Acts. However, Jesus also sends them out in the course of the gospel narrative. And so, in some way, that's sort of why it's appropriate to speak of perhaps even Judas Iscariot, who would betray Jesus, as an apostle in some way, because he is sent out along with the rest of the 12 here in Luke. Of course, that will change by the time we get to Acts, but that's for another day. But here in the very beginning of chapter 9, it says that Jesus called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. And he said to them, "Take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not have 2 tunics. And whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And wherever they do not receive you, when you leave that town, shake off the dust from your feet as a testimony against them. And they departed and went through the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. Some things I want to point out here. So number one, he gives them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. So basically, he gives them the ability to do the sorts of things that Jesus has been doing himself. So if you think about the different miracles that Jesus has been doing, basically all of them revolve around casting out demons, curing diseases, things of that nature. And so he's basically saying, I'm going to give you the power to do the types of miracles that I have been doing. I am going to deputize you in my mission to bring about the justice of God, to bring about this restoration, sight to the blind, freedom to captives, everything that is kind of wrapped up in that Luke 4 Nazareth synagogue Isaiah scroll mission. But he also says something interesting to them. Take nothing for your journey, no staff, bag, bread, money, and do not have 2 tunics. This is interesting. So he's instructing them to leave behind, do not take with them, really any sort of material possessions that you might ordinarily take on a journey. A staff perhaps for protection, a bag to store things in, bread, money. He's instructing them to rely upon the provision of those to whom they have been sent. It's also interesting that he explicitly says, do not have 2 tunics. So there's kind of 2 things going on here. There's, number one, just a reliance on the provision of God through those they are ministering to. Whatever house you enter, stay there. Don't seek other lodging. But also the 2 tunics kind of recalls something that John the Baptist said. When people were asking John, how should we live in light of this baptism of repentance? He said, well, to the one who has 2 tunics, he should take the one that he doesn't need and give it to someone else. So this kind of leveling out of people's possessions. So this theme of, from Isaiah, really, John's preparing the way of the Lord, making the high places low, making the low places high, kind of filling out in the desert the highway of God. This idea of bringing sort of a divine equality to God's people. And so really his instruction to not have 2 tunics kind of implies that if somebody takes advantage of you and takes the tunic you do have, you don't have an extra one. And so really there's this sense that they are to not only rely on God's provision, but also to perhaps be vulnerable in some way, to open themselves to perhaps suffering or being inconvenienced as they are carrying out this mission, which is interesting. So he's really instructing them to act like he does, to be like Jesus in a significant way. Jesus is kind of this itinerant preacher. He does not, that we know of, have material possessions as such. And so he's really instructing them to imitate him in the way that they go about this prophetic style mission. And so they go out, they went through all the villages, presumably villages that Jesus perhaps has been to as well, preaching the gospel, healing everywhere. Now, again, this idea of the gospel is the gospel in the sense of good news to the poor, Isaiah gospel. So not necessarily what Paul will express later on, believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved, but more the justice of God is here. the agent of God's salvation is bringing about the restoration of God's people. That is the message that seems to be in view here. So it's significant that the disciples, especially the 12, have been following Jesus this whole time, and now they are being empowered to act as he does. And after this, we get kind of another scene where Jesus is explicitly involving the 12 in what he does. So verses 12 through 17, he says, or Luke says, "Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came to him and said to him, 'Send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions, for we are here in a desolate place.'" So the 12 have returned. Jesus is now resuming his usual activity of preaching to crowds. And so there's a crowd around him. It's getting dark. The 12 are saying, well, these people, they're going to get hungry. We need to do something about this. So send them away. But Jesus said to them, "You give them something to eat." Okay, guys, you have just been sent out with miraculous power to heal and to cast out demons and to preach the gospel of the justice of God. You do it. And they said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." Now think about this. They've just been sent out with no money bag, no bread to heal and preach and things, and presumably God has provided for them in the midst of that circumstance. And now they come back and they're like, "Oh, here's a bunch of hungry people. I guess we don't have any food. Do we have to go spend a bunch of money? How is this going to happen?" It's kind of odd that they sort of revert to this way of thinking, given what they've just done. But I think that's part of the point of this story. So there's about 5,000 men, it says, and so it's unreasonable to actually bankroll this meal for all these people. And he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." And they did so, and had them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing over them. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the crowd. And they all ate and were satisfied. And what was left over was picked up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. A couple of interesting things. We're told at the beginning of this section that they're in a desolate place. God providing food for his people in desolate places in the wilderness is perhaps a callback to the story of Israel, right? Manna from heaven feeding Israel in the wilderness. It's interesting that Jesus does not simply perform this miracle, but it says he takes the materials, the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, blesses them, breaks the loaves, and gives those loaves to the disciples. It's not super clear exactly what is happening. You know, how do these 5 loaves and 2 fish that he gives to the disciples turn into all of this food for all these people? You know, what would that look like? It's really hard to tell. But the important thing that I want to draw your attention to is the fact that Jesus has the disciples be the delivery mechanism for this food. He doesn't simply do the miracle and then say, "Hey, everybody, 5,000 people, here's this food that I have now produced for you as the agent of God's salvation." He doesn't quite do that. He allows his disciples to participate in the feeding of this crowd. And that's significant. So we get this sense that even as the disciples are being drawn into perhaps the conflict between Jesus and his enemies, even so, they are being drawn into the mission that Jesus is fulfilling here. They are being, like I said a couple minutes ago, deputized as those who are to participate in what Jesus is doing. So Jesus is the one who performs the miracle, but it's the 12 who actually deliver it to the people. I think that's significant. So Jesus, kind of transitioning from interacting with this crowd, he kind of reverts to one of his usual practices, which is to be alone and to pray. And so we read this. Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him. Kind of interesting. He's praying alone, but the disciples are with him. And he asked them, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist. But others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old has risen." Then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "The Christ of God." And he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." So here we have Jesus and his disciples having more or less a private conversation about what the crowds have been saying about him. Now, what they say here is consistent with what we've heard the crowd say previously. So, for example, let me see if I can grab this. Where did it go? Oh, maybe it's down here. Trying to find. Here we go. When Jesus raises the widow's son, this is one of the stories that we talked about last time. The people who witness this respond by saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us. God has visited his people." And so they see what Jesus does in raising the widow's son back to life and respond by saying, "Well, this must be a great prophet. This must be somebody that God has sent to minister to his people." And so this idea that the crowds would say that he's a prophet of some kind is perhaps expected. However, the other two options that are suggested might surprise us. So John the Baptist, it's a little bit difficult to tell, is John dead at this point? Has he been already executed by Herod? And so do the crowds think that Jesus is perhaps John the Baptist risen from the dead or miraculously escaped from prison or something like this? That's kind of interesting. You wouldn't think that there would be any confusion about John versus Jesus, and these are two separate people, but it may be that, if the crowds had kind of acknowledged that John the Baptist was an Elijah-esque prophet, then maybe they have the impression that he is risen from the dead somehow. Others say Elijah. So this idea that God would send a prophet in the power and spirit of Elijah. And keep in mind, in the Old Testament narratives, Elijah does not actually physically die. He seems to be carried up into heaven without experiencing death. And so perhaps the idea that Jesus is Elijah returned, come back down to earth, could be what is going on here. And then there's kind of this third generic option: one of the prophets of old has risen. But the picture that we get here is that Jesus is being perceived as an Old Testament prophet of some kind. And so this is the impression that the crowd has of who Jesus is. And so he then turns the question back on the disciples. Who do you say that I am? And Peter is the one who steps forward and answers, the Christ of God. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but just briefly, I want to at least acknowledge the fact that what we commonly think of as sort of messianic expectation, who is the Messiah expected to be by first century Jews? There is a diversity of different things that people were expecting to see in the Messiah. And we can see this in various Second Temple era texts, material from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, all these sorts of things. People were expecting a Messiah who was a prophet, a Messiah who was like a priest, or perhaps a Davidic king. And so when Peter answers the Christ of God, what exactly he envisions when he says that, you are the Christ of God, is a little bit difficult to pin down. And so, is he saying, I think you're the Christ of God, which is very different from you being Elijah-esque or a prophetic figure? Is he saying you are the Christ of God as in you are a Davidic king? What is he actually saying there? But it's interesting that regardless of what Peter has in his mind when he says that Jesus is the Christ of God, the way that Jesus explains, or at least the way that Jesus proceeds from Peter's confession there, is interesting. You'll note that Jesus does not say, yes, Peter, that is a good answer. You are right. He does not say that. In fact, he commands them to tell no one. And the reason for this, apparently, is that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Now, this question of why would Jesus want to conceal his identity as the Christ? Why? We've seen him before instruct demons who have recognized him as the Christ of God or the Holy One of God. He's instructed them to shut up, to not tell anyone about this. And there's a lot of different ideas about why this might be. I think in the context of Luke, at least one important thing is that until the resurrection, no one can understand what Jesus is doing or how he is accomplishing the salvation of God. Consistently, this information, this revelation is hidden from people, or most notably the disciples. They don't understand things that Jesus says about the fact that he must suffer and die. And so this is kind of the beginning of that. And so, why should they tell no one? Well, he needs to suffer and die first. So Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection are important here. But what I really want to draw your attention to is that this is the very, very first mention of Jesus' suffering and death. It has not been really brought up until now. We've had Jesus reference opposition. He's entered into this conflict with the religious authorities. He's instructed his disciples as to how to behave in light of similar opposition, but this is the first time that we get an indication that this opposition will become lethal. Up till now, this idea that this conflict will bring about Jesus' death has not come up. And so we have this kind of change in tone here. In Luke 8, we saw this unstoppable mission, Jesus's mission kind of surging forward with all these miracles. But now we see Jesus revealing that his destiny as the Christ will involve his suffering, death, and resurrection. And so that's some new information. And in some ways, this is actually surprising. So there's a few things that I want to point out here in what he says. So the first thing, I've already covered that. So this opposition, this conflict with the religious authorities will become lethal. Jesus will die as a result of it. But second, the conflict subplot is reintroduced, and we get the sense that it will escalate. So the conflict that Jesus has experienced so far will get worse. How do we know this? Well, notice that he talks about the elders and the chief priests. Up until this point, we have only really come into contact with the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers, religious experts, religious teachers. But no mention has been made of the elders and the chief priests. And so what's new here is that by the time we do reach that lethal climax of Jesus's conflict with the authorities, we're going to be dealing with kind of the upper echelons of Jewish religious hierarchy. Particularly, the chief priests are associated with Jerusalem. And so that's kind of up a level from, for example, Pharisees coming to visit Jesus back in chapter 5 to see what he's doing and investigate him. Things will have risen to a very high level in terms of the authorities who are coming after Jesus. And third, along with being the first mention of Jesus' suffering and death, this is the first mention of Jesus being raised from the dead. And so, really, although this saying that Jesus utters here indicates that yes, this opposition will be lethal, the lethality will also be met with vindication in Jesus' resurrection. And so this prediction, this revelation that Jesus makes here, introduces kind of a new plot line to this story. So not only is Jesus the agent of God's salvation, not only does he face opposition, but we have outlined for us here a sequence of lethal rejection and then vindication. However, the thing to keep in mind, and the thing that's going to be important in this next section that we're about to look at, this is antithetical to the expectations that have been created so far. We would not expect, Jesus as the agent of God's salvation to be able to do these miraculous things, to be the agent of God's salvation, to bring about the justice of God. We would not expect that figure to have to undergo suffering and death. And yet, that is what Jesus says here. And so we have this tension between what has already happened, what the disciples have seen, versus what they are hearing from Jesus now in this moment. Those two things are contradictory, seemingly. And so all in all, as readers, this saying here, this prediction of Jesus' suffering and death, really kind of changes our perspective. And so we see that the conflict that we've seen so far is going to become lethal, and so this will shape our expectations going forward. And so we as readers are kind of getting a sense of, all right, this is where this story is going. This is where we're heading. And so the rest of the story is kind of being forecast for us. There's foreshadowing happening here. So Jesus continues. I'm going to bring this up for you here. So, verse 22, the Son of Man must suffer many things, etc., etc. And now, even more than this, in addition to this, he says, and he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed, when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God. So, interesting, Son of Man language again. So we had Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man to describe the escalation and the development of this lethal conflict. And now he explains what it means to be someone who follows this Son of Man who suffers, dies, and rises again. And so what this saying does, this idea that whoever is ashamed of me, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him, this further incorporates Jesus' followers into his own story of suffering and vindication. And so back in the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus said that blessed are you when people revile you on account of the Son of Man. So incorporating the disciples into his own story. And now he's kind of building on that this time by using the language of taking up one's cross and losing one's life. And so this seems to be metaphorical. So not saying that literally the disciples are going to be in lethal danger every day, but the idea is that they should be willing, take up their cross, be willing to die for the sake of the Son of Man daily. And so if the disciples are to participate in the vindication that Jesus will bring, that is, Jesus coming with the glory of the Father and the holy angels, then they must also participate in his story of obedience unto death. And so in the sermon, we saw this idea that blessed are you when people persecute you on account of the Son of Man. That was tied to the type of criticism and opposition and persecution that Jesus had faced so far. And that was largely verbal. So criticism, critique. The Pharisees saying, you should not do that which is not lawful, stuff like that. But now that the stakes have been raised, and now that the opposition that Jesus is going to face has become lethal, so too the disciples need to participate in that. They must follow him in facing that kind of opposition. Whether, the language is metaphorical or not, that's what they're being called to do. And so the implication here seems to be that if, on the one hand, rejecting Jesus and his words will cause rejection by God, faithfulness to Jesus, by being obedient unto death, by taking up the cross in the face of opposition, will bring about the same vindication from the Father that Jesus himself will experience in the resurrection. So the point here is that if the disciples are to follow Jesus faithfully, then his story of suffering and death and resurrection will become their story as well. That is the point here. Okay. So, think we've covered that. So now we move to the Transfiguration. This episode brings a lot of these ideas together in a really interesting way. So let's read through this. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory, and the 2 men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. As he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud, saying, "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. So a few things to note here. The Transfiguration is connected with the previous scene. So this scene where, Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, Jesus predicts his own suffering and death, and then incorporates the disciples into that narrative of suffering and death, that is in the background as we move into this Transfiguration episode. 8 days after these sayings is the way that this section begins in verse 28. And so it seems that we are meant to have the previous section in mind when we look at this episode. And we also might keep in mind the glory or doxa of the Son of Man, the Father, and the holy angels from verse 22. We do see glory on the mountain. But this is different from the glory that the Son of Man will have when he returns with his holy angels. And so the glory that comes upon Jesus on the mountain, causing his face to change and his appearance to be bright, this is a temporary glory. And so we're not to the final glory of the Son of Man. But interestingly, the appearance of Moses and Elijah kind of appearing as these brightly shining men, apparently, that kind of suggests angels. Oftentimes angels appear as human beings with bright appearance. Kind of interesting. So in verse 30, go back one frame here. We are told to behold. And so, behold, 2 men were talking with him, and then Peter and his friends awake. And so, we're kind of taking on the viewpoint of the disciples here. We are meant to see this through their eyes. And what do they see? Well, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. And this shapes their understanding of what is happening here. They see this glory, and this kind of overcomes what they have heard. So in this episode, there is a tension between hearing and seeing. Keep that in mind. Hearing and seeing. So they see this glory and they say, well, we should stay here. We should make this last as long as possible. But they seem to have forgotten that Jesus has already explained how his ultimate glory will come about. And that is through his suffering, death, and resurrection. And so you can't prematurely grasp the glory of Jesus' vindication before that vindication has occurred, before the resurrection has happened. And so they seem to have kind of temporary amnesia about what Jesus told them. They see this glory and they're fixated by it. And Jesus is even speaking with Moses and Elijah concerning his departure. And so, behold, two men were talking with him. They're speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And so, even the content of the conversation, Peter and his friends are seemingly unable to comprehend. The word for departure there, exodos, of course, the same Greek word is used for exodus, the exit, the way out for Israel out of Egypt. And so Jesus is talking with them about his departure, which seems to be his suffering, death, resurrection, and ascension, his departure from earth. But the apostles don't seem to be able to understand this either. And so they are rejoicing at this kind of temporary vision of Jesus's coming glory, this sort of short-lived moment of glory. But they seem to have forgotten that not only must Jesus suffer, but they must suffer as well before vindication can occur. And so the disciples are overwhelmed by what they see, and they have forgotten what they heard from Jesus. So once again, this tension between hearing and seeing. So they go down from the mountain. Let me see if I can grab the text again. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention, this would be good to say. The voice that speaks from heaven, the voice that comes out of the cloud, this is my son, my chosen one. What does he say? Listen to him. Well, listen to him saying what? Well, the disciples have not sufficiently internalized Jesus' words about suffering, death, and vindication. They have not internalized this. And so this is a reminder to don't focus on what you are seeing. Don't focus on the miracles. Don't focus on what seems to be Jesus's triumph over illness, over death, over demons. Listen to what he is saying. Don't be taken away from the narrative of suffering because of what you are seeing. And Jesus instructs them to tell no one. Don't tell people about this glory that you've witnessed, because that's not the point. The point is that before glory can take place, suffering and death must be endured. So they go down from the mountain on the next day, and they're met by a great crowd. And here again we get another healing scene. Jesus performs another seemingly impossible miracle. Check this out. This man has a child who is taken by a spirit. The spirit convulses the child, And he asked the disciples to cast it out. The disciples have already been casting out demons when they were sent out by Jesus, but they are unable to cast out this particular demon. But Jesus is able to do it. And so, once again, we have Jesus doing something that seems impossible. The disciples are not able to do it, even with the sort of deputy status that they have in Jesus' mission. But here, Jesus says something that's really interesting. And so this kind of makes it seem like we're going back to that surging forth of Jesus' mission through miracles. But immediately after he does this miracle, it says, "But while they were all marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, 'Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men.'" And it says, furthermore, "They did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying." What's going on here? Well, Jesus is not going to let the impossible nature of the miracle that he just performed drag the disciples off track. He says, "Look, listen here, guys, listen up. Put these words into your ears. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." Remember what I told you about being killed by the religious authorities, suffering death and resurrection? That's still going to happen. Don't forget. But we see that none of this will make sense to the disciples until it happens. They are not able to understand all of these things that Jesus is saying about his suffering and death until the resurrection. They did not understand the saying, "It is concealed from them." They cannot perceive it. And so we get this theme that will continue throughout the rest of the gospel, that the resurrection is the key to understanding Jesus' mission. Apart from the resurrection, Jesus just seems like a miracle worker who was killed. But the resurrection is the key to understanding everything that Jesus is doing. And so once again, the narrative that Jesus has been forecasting for himself, suffering, death, resurrection, the narrative that the disciples have heard, has been obscured by what they are seeing. And so Jesus is trying to tamp that down. So we see that the concepts that have been developed by the Son of Man references thus far are being reinforced here. Suffering is essential for both Jesus' mission and for the life of his disciples. So in spite of all these miracles, we cannot escape this. It's a key part of the story. Couple other things I want to draw your attention to. We are going to stop there, but just to kind of, I guess, point us to some things that are going to happen. We are about to see Jesus turn towards Jerusalem. And so we're kind of in this place where Jesus has described what is going to happen to him, and also he's kind of indirectly referenced the place where it is going to happen. That is Jerusalem. That is where the chief priests are. And so next time, we're going to see Jesus actually set out to go to Jerusalem. He has been in the region of Galilee thus far, but now we're going to see him go towards Jerusalem. And this is kind of ominous. He is intentionally moving towards the place of suffering, the place where that will take place. And so all of these things that have been building up so far, not only Jesus' prediction of what will happen to him, but how the disciples relate to this, are going to become more and more important as we go forward. But we will leave that for next time. Cool. Well, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Also, if you would be interested in um, doing some sessions even after the series is over during the summer, I would appreciate feedback about that if enough folks are interested. That might be a thing. So if you are interested, please do let me know either via email or some other method of communication. I'd love to get that feedback from you. But we will pick things up next time, starting in chapter 9, verse 50, and begin the turn towards Jerusalem. Thanks, y'all. We do have a question. How do the disciples understand the phrase "take up your cross"? Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Um, so we see Jesus mention this phrase "take up your cross" before we really specifically know that the cross will be his method of execution. Um, and so when we read that, the phrase "take up your cross" kind of has this generic association with obedience unto death, death to self, that sort of thing. But here Jesus is using it to describe this method of discipleship. Like I said, before we really get a sense that the cross is the place where Jesus is going, if that makes sense. So the cross as an idea hasn't really entered the story. And so I kind of understand this as being a generic reference to death to self. Um, why would you take up a cross? Well, it's because you are experiencing lethal oppression, or at least perhaps metaphorically lethal oppression or opposition. And so the idea of taking up your cross is, how do you respond to that? Well, you bear up the cross and move forward. Um, he doesn't really say get on your cross daily, if that makes sense. Um, but I take that to be a reference to just kind of generic death to self. Uh, I think the disciples would have understood that, because the only context where you would be taking up your cross is because of that kind of opposition. Um, but I don't think they would have understood it in terms of Jesus's cross per se. It's a good question. All right, I'll see y'all next week.